So thanks for the introduction, Annie. A bit of info about myself before I dive into the topic. So professionally, I used to have an academic career. I didn't lose it or anything. I just stopped being an academic. Computer science. So I have a technical background. I'm a programmer. And I stopped my academic path to join a spin-off team at the Weavi, which is the topic of my topic today, of my talk today. I'll come back to that later. Personally, I'm father to my daughter, of course, which is 2, and I had that daughter with my wife. I'm a petrol head and a metal head, so if it's about cars or heavy music, you can always come and talk to me about that, and I'll be very passionate about whatever topic we decide to discuss. So to give you a bit of background on the whole spin-off story, there was this research track at my lab which focused on no-code citizen science applications. So basically, citizen science, you have a group of citizens that are concerned about something in their environment. Could be noise pollution, air pollution, counting crows in their backyards. Doesn't really matter what. And they use, what we noticed that they use a lot of pen and paper approaches to collect all of that data about which they're concerned, right? Kind of like the tailors in the IO story we heard just right now. And the big problem is that in contrast to Café Costume, they didn't have any budget. Usually they don't have any budgets. These are non-for-profits. And when you look at the price of an app, it's quickly like 20, 30, 40K. That's too much money. And so we decided to set up a research track to figure out, can we make these usually non-technical people develop their own applications? So can we create a platform which allows non-technical people to build data collection systems? And that's one of the examples of the resulting applications that we got, which was an air pollution monitoring system. So you had smartphones connected to black carbon sensors. We had volunteers running around Ghent. And so they built this in a no-code fashion. Back then, no-code was a term that was not really around that much, but that's basically what it is. So I joined that team back when the research track almost ended. It was the end of a research project, and the goal was to create a spin-off company out of it. Now, the citizen science market is not really a market. It's small, right? I just said that they don't really have a lot of money. And so from a moral perspective, we didn't feel like the fit was good, in the sense that these people don't have a lot of money. They're putting all of their own time and usually their own money into measuring something which is important to all of us. And so we didn't want to start taking away money to give them access to our platform. And so I basically spent about a year meeting over 100 people in sort of 3 different sectors of activity in order to find a market which had a problem that we could solve with our technology. That went from the Industry 4.0 to the events market, which was a really bad time because that was right when Corona hit, to the tracking of people and goods, all of that. So would they need a no-code platform to build apps, basically? Nothing really stuck. We tried out different value propositions like smoke screen, websites and landing pages, and nothing really worked. And then I met this lady, which is Tinne Peters. She's a COO, I believe, at Studio Dot, which is a design agency in Antwerp. I met her at a EU matchmaking event about smart cities, I think. And so I presented the concept, I explained her the idea, and she said that she really liked those kinds of tools and that they are looking for these kinds of solutions to build prototypes. Now, at that point, I knew nothing about UX or UI, and I thought that design was basically something that you put on something you sell to make it more expensive, right? It's like, it's a designer chair, so it's ×2 for the price. I knew that there was design involved in digital aspects as well, but I thought it was limited to like the colors of buttons and all of that. To me, a prototype as a developer, it was just basically a product which you just half-assed. You program really quickly, and that's a prototype, and then you ship it. And so she introduced me to this wonderful world of UI and UX. She made me read This is Service Design Thinking. She introduced me to UX Antwerp, so I saw a lot of the talks of people that came before me. I started looking at tools like Figma and the Nielsen Norman group. And falling in love is maybe a bit of a big word, but I was it was a real eye-opener to really understand what it means to design something for humans, to put their problems in the center and not just slap technology on top of stuff. And I saw that there was indeed this prototyping phase in design where our tool could potentially be of use to designers. And so I figured, okay, I'm going to do the design approach, right? So I'm not going to just jump to conclusions, and I'm going to try to figure out more about how design works and specifically how prototyping fits into that design process. And so I had a lot of interviews with maybe some of you here. These are all design agencies, mostly located in Flanders, which all happily agreed to talk to me. That was really refreshing. I had a lot of trouble getting into those different other kinds of markets because people don't want to talk to you. And I was surprised by the fact that the UI UX community is that open. And so if I have to summarize my interviews with all of these agencies, with regards to prototyping, of course, in one quote, it's from Jan from Leap Forward, who told me that prototypes are the deliverable of design. So I understood that although it's maybe not the most important part of the design process, it's a very important one, at least. And for me, at least, the role of prototypes is twofold. So on one hand, it's the ability to test, and on the other hand, it's the ability to talk. So you use a prototype to test everything going from UI elements to interactions to even the core ID, right? Does the product that we're developing or designing, does it make sense? Does it actually solve the problem that we initially identified in the previous phase? And of course, usability tests, as we saw in the previous talk. And then you use prototypes as well to talk, both internally and with customers, right? It provides a common ground to talk about the IDs, puts them on paper, makes it easier to discuss them, to discard some of them, to scope the project. What are we going to do? Is that really necessary? Can we just drop that feature? And in some cases, to convince customers of the usefulness of actually doing user tests, right? If you can show, look, we're going to use that prototype to gather feedback on what is clear, what flows are unclear. That for me is the talk reason of using prototypes. Now, controversial statement, one that I'll be glad to defend later on. I also learned that the higher fidelity your prototype, usually the better you're able to use it to test and to talk. Now, I know that in theory, every level of prototyping or every fidelity level of prototyping provides you with different kinds of feedback, and that you should start with wireframes because they don't have your bias and your vision ingrained in them, and so you leave doors open for other solutions. But in practice, everybody told me like, okay, that's the theory, but in practice, we don't do wireframing a lot. And I heard two main reasons. The first one is people have trouble with that abstraction level. They see a wireframe and they have trouble to really look through the fact that it's white and black and that there's crosses everywhere and see what the potential is. And the second one is that it's hard to stick to a wireframe with today's tooling. I heard a lot of examples of people starting out with the goal of wireframing in Figma, but then catching themselves adding color or adding basic functionality, at which point it's no longer really a wireframe, right? And so to give you an idea of some of the examples that I had for high fidelity prototyping, or going as far as you can before you actually do user testing or you talk with customers. In the testing category, I heard a lot of examples of designing for non-digital demographics. So think elderly and disabled people, where having a high fidelity prototype removes some of these possible barriers. For example, in the elderly, a case was having to log in and put your email address in an input field, and then having to explain during a user test that what the elderly person is looking at on a phone is not actually an app, so they can't actually put their email address there, but they just should simulate that and press the next button, right? That's one hurdle to remove if you can have a high fidelity prototype with an actual typable input field. Similarly, in the case of the disabled people, and especially mentally disabled people, if you have a design with sort of a generic name on top of it, you're logged in as John, or it says, hey, John. If you're not called John, that can be a hurdle for some people, right? And in the case of talking with customers and specifically persuading customers of doing user tests, I had a talk with Maarten Hazebroek from Hoofdwerk, and I got this classification from him. So no props to me for that. But he told me that there's basically 3 types of company when it comes to user testing. You have the companies that are already convinced, so the immediate yes companies, right? Those you don't need to convince. But then you have 2 types of company that you do need to convince. One are the materialists, so they say no at first, but given enough evidence and given enough material, prototypes, use cases, previous interviews and what you learned, you're able to convince them to do a user test for that specific project. And then you have the data fetishists, which typically would tell you that having user interview with 5 people is not representative. And you can only convince those with sort of hardcore statistics, lots of data, which is hard to come by, but which is easier, of course, to obtain if you have higher fidelity prototypes. And so I tried to set out to find pain points in prototyping today. And of course, these are biased. I mean, I found some of them, and I'm going to discuss the ones that are, of course, relevant to us, because I wanted to find pain points that we can solve with our technology. The first one is what we would call fake interactions. So although with tools today, you can, like Figma, you can go pretty far in what you can mock up and what you can prototype with regards to functionality, at some point you're limited, especially in interaction features. So if you have an input field, with Figma, that's not an input field, that's just a rectangle, which is white, maybe with some placeholder text. And even if you could bring it to life, the data that you inputted, for example, a name, wouldn't show up in subsequent screens on your prototype. And so what I've seen a lot is people re-implementing functionality, for example, radio buttons, having all of these different states for your radio button and mocking that up, which makes your prototype become very complex very quickly. So that's one of the pains that we saw. And the second pain is that it's difficult to go beyond lab-tested usability with prototypes. At the end of the day, without sort of demeaning the work of Figma or the work that people put into Figma prototypes, they're clickable images. You can't ask your user to take that clickable image and to take it back home, use that application for a week, and then have an interview to see what went wrong, what went right, because it's just a clickable image. And so you're unable to test out some core IDs of your product because you can't test them in context or because you can't test them for longer periods without going to development, of course. So these are sort of the 2 pains that we set out to solve by adapting that platform that we had for citizen science and adapting it to the needs of designers, which basically entails that we scrapped the entire platform and started from scratch, except from some bare bones backend stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to do a live demo to give you an idea of what that looks like in practice. It's live, so it can always go wrong, but of course I have a backup video. So what you're looking at here is my attempt, and you immediately see that I'm not a designer, right? My attempt at a UX Beer app. So you log into the UX Beers app, and then you have 3 tabs, one to go see who's attending, who are the speakers, and then you have one that brings you to a map to see like all of the people that join remotely, where are they joining from around the globe, right? So this is standard Figma, so it's some boxes, and then there's some prototyping features to go from one screen to the next. What you would do using Weavi, which now it has gone from citizen science to a Figma plugin, is that you would gradually add functionality to your design. So in this case, I would say this is an input field. The rectangle is the container, and your name is sort of the placeholder. And what I want to capture, of course, is the text that you input as the name. And instead of saying, "Hey, John," I want this John part here to become a label to reflect the name that the person enters upon logging into the application. And then as a final feature for this crash course demo, I want this square here to become an actual map so that I can prototype that as well. And this button here will become the GPS on button. So let me quickly save what I did here. So you have your design as you always did, right? And then you have the Weavi editor, which allows you to configure some of the functionality that you just added to your design. So in this case, we want to say that input field, all of that data should be sent into that label. So it doesn't say, hey, John, but it says, hey, whatever the person's name is. And then I also want to capture the user's location whenever that GPS button is pressed. And I want to turn that location into a map marker, which I should then, of course, display on the map. And so if I combine this, I have a prototype which I can now test out. It's a progressive web app, so I can test it out myself, but I could also hand it to potential end users to test them. So I enter my name, I press enter. You see that hey John is removed by hey Florian, and when I go to the map, I get a fully functional map. Turn on the GPS, and it will show you my my live location here. And so you now have from your design something that you can put in the hands of your users. They can test it for extended periods of time, or in general, it's higher fidelity, so you expect to get better feedback from the user. The thing is, now that it's in the hands of your users, you might as well get more data than you would do in a qualitative interview, although, of course, a qualitative interview is still a good way to get data out of it. But now that it's running and it's completely functional, you can go a step further and start getting a lot of quantitative data as well. So every prototype by default is going to track sort of click heat maps. Where do people click, right? As well as the average time spent on a specific screen. You can start loading in sessions to see what did people do, right? Did they go from screen A, B, C back to A? If there's a loop, maybe something is unclear. And then we have some more experimental features, such as this radar chart here, which displays the average sentiment. So we capture the feed of the front-facing camera. We take pictures every couple of seconds, and we run an AI algorithm to do sentiment analysis in order to start detecting mood swings, basically. Because in general, if there's a mood swing on a specific screen and you see that recurrence across users, might be an indication that there's something going on the screen, right? Can be good, can be bad. So that's a sort of crash overview into the prototype that we have now, which obviously, given that I'm a newbie UX person, I decided to user test. So we had 6 user tests so far with agencies, with 2 still lined up, which provided us of a ton of information. And I'm going to share you some of the good things and some of the bad things that we found out. The first one is to really pick your icons well. So the plugin is basically divided into 2 screens. One screen to do the configuration between your plugin and the Weavi platform. So it's some ID stuff and API keys. So you do that once and then it's done. And then the one with the sliders is where you actually select layers and configure. But both these icons basically mean the same thing. They both mean setting. We didn't notice this at first, but we saw that a lot of people were confused on which tab they should use. And then we asked, and they said, like, yeah, but both icons mean settings. That's a really bad icon choice. So we figured that out through the user test. A second thing is that we immediately noticed our own sort of technical backgrounds bias leaking into the design. So if you have a rectangle, which could potentially be an input, because the plugin is smart enough to notice, okay, this can't be an input, so I'm not going to present it as an option in the component overview menu. But if it can be an input, you see checkbox and text and radio, which are self-explanatory. But then there's field and text area. And those are HTML terminology, which a lot of designers don't know. And we noticed that because throughout the user test, everybody almost consistently picked the wrong one, namely the first one, because they didn't know the difference between both. So that's our own bias sort of leaking into the design, something that we should definitely take into account in the next version. Something that we did right is the overall process. So the way it works now, as I've shown you, is you have your design, you select parts of your design that you want to add functionality to, and then we automatically generate that for you. The other way of working, which we considered for a moment, was you would use the plugin to generate sort of generic components. Let's say I want a radio button. we would generate in Figma a generic radio button, which you would then style. And we noticed right away that that's not the way designers work. You have components, design systems, all of these pre-built things that you're used to using, and you don't want to sort of restyle a generic radio button generated by us, but you want to add functionality to the radio buttons that you already pre-styled or made yourself. So we hit the mark on that part. And then one thing which is not really either a win or a loss. I know that a good tool makes sure that the users don't adapt to the tool, but that the tool adapts to the user. But this is one example where it's kind of hard to do that, and that's the difference in thinking. So on the left, you see an example of how you could today build a radio button in Figma. So what you would do is you would sort of map out all of the different possible states, and then through interactions make sure that it looks like it's actually a functioning radio button. While if you use our plugin, that's not the way it works. You draw your radio button, your radio group, you tell the plugin, okay, this is going to be a radio group, we bring that to life for you, right? So there's no need to map out all of those different states. Ideally, that's not the case for the moment, but you could also explain the plugin how it would look like once an option is selected. It's the default HTML blue circle now, but later on it could be pink square for all we know. You could just provide that as input as well. So before I leave the stage, I couldn't help, of course, but try to use the fact that I have this audience right now of UI and UX designers to sort of validate some of the assumptions that we've used so far and some of the value propositions that we propose. So you go to menti.com and you can enter the code at the top, and I should see the answers coming in. So of course it's I don't think I need to explain this to this audience, but it's a Likert scale, right? So you have a statement, and then the question is to just strongly disagree or strongly agree. There's two sort of critical assumptions: the fact that high fidelity prototypes or higher fidelity prototypes mean better testing results. So that's the test part of prototyping. The second statement is that higher fidelity prototypes result in better customer interactions. So basically the talk part, right, allows you to more easily convince customers to do user research, that sort of stuff. And then the final two are related to Weavi's value proposition, namely the fact that we would enable you to build higher fidelity prototypes. And the second part, that the analytics dashboard that I showed would be of added value for your user test. That kind of quantitative data is of value when you're doing user test and when you're building out a product. So I see that my time is sort of running out, so I'm going to move to the next slide. But do please answer this, because I would be really happy to see the results once I'm finished with my talk. I saw some. Well, looks like some of them at least strongly agree with. I'll come back to that later. So yeah, I'm going to wrap up to leave some time for Q&A. So by all means, I would like to keep the discussion going, which I have with some of you. You can, if you're interested in the plugin itself, you can leave your email address at weavly.com/coming soon. It's not a newsletter. I'm not going to start spamming you. It's just that we keep a list of people that could potentially be interested once we do an official launch or even an open beta. And so if you're interested, leave your email address and I'll contact you once the time comes. You can always follow the progress on my LinkedIn or on Weavi's LinkedIn. And if you have something that you really want to talk about, you want to give feedback or tell me that I'm completely wrong, I'm always open for a virtual coffee. And you can book a meeting with me at meter.be/schedule, and I'll be happy to talk. Thanks a lot for the attention, and I'm here to answer any questions you have.
Wow, thank you so much, Florian. That was a really impressive tool and demo, and also a really impressive story. There's a couple of questions for you. I think I'll start with what you started with, which was more of your journey towards UX. I mean, personally, I love hearing stories about how people fall in love with UX, because I think it really hits a personal mark for people looking for something more personal in their work, or to make an impact on on people's lives and their communities. So thank you for sharing that story. There was a question about how, as a person who's discovering this world, what part did you most enjoy as part of the process? Like, was it the details? Was it the testing and the interviews? Like, what was the part that you enjoy the most about your journey towards UX?
I think hands down the people. I was surprised by how open and how willing UI UX people are to just have a discussion. It's inherent. You put people at the center of everything, so it makes sense that you would be open to have an interview with people you don't know. But that doesn't mean you need to help people for free, right? Because we're a startup, so you contact someone, it's like, hey, I'm doing this thing. Would you be open to have like an hour to talk to me? And I've had almost zero no's. While in other markets that we try to sort of discover, it was really hard to just get people to talk to you. So that would be absolutely the best thing. The worst thing, and that's a personal thing, because I'm a computer scientist, so I like definitions and stuff to be extremely precise. Is sometimes the lack of precision, right? Which makes sense because it's a very human thing, so you can't stick an exact definition on everything. But I have to adapt to the fact that not everything is black and white, and most things are a spectrum.
Yeah, I think any UX designer would agree with you there. We're not super precise, but we definitely have the love. So thank you for that. That's great. There was a question specifically about the tool, which I find really impressive, actually. It sounds like you've solved a lot of problems around prototyping and things, which were a pain point for users. There was a question that says, on the fear of opening a toolbar again, are you going to integrate with new interactive component states in Figma? Is that a plan for you?
So the plan is to be as little as a tool as possible, which is why we opted for the plugin developments. The goal is to integrate everything from Figma as much as possible. So, for example, the interactions, that's something that we integrate from the back, because we want to be able to, ideally, you don't add anything. It's just you import you install the plugin. We take all of the information out of Figma. And if you want to use only the analytics part, then you don't add any functionality. So the goal is to reuse as much as possible, because we know that you iterate a lot. So that having to change something in Figma and then change it again in a different tool, that's hell. If we can avoid that, that's a win. And so we don't integrate with sort of variants and all of that yet, but all of that is on our roadmap.
Okay, cool. And then I think we have time for one more question from Marianne. How do you measure sentiment in Weavi?
So we rely on AWS for that. So they have a service which allows you to send images as blobs, so as just bytes, arrays of bytes. They run their neural network on that, and they give you back a list of emotions. We opted for AWS for the simple reason that they have so much data to train on, that by the time that you train your own AI to do the same thing, it doesn't make sense. So we use AWS for that.
Okay, that makes sense. Cool. All right. Well, those are all the questions that we have for now. If you have more questions for Florian, there will be a Q&A in the sessions afterwards, so I encourage you to go meet him there. Florian, thank you so much for talking about your own personal story, but then also introducing us to Weavi. It sounds like a really impressive tool. And it's a local startup, right?
Yep.
So a great organization and company to support as UX designers. So check it out.